One of the questions I get often asked by leaders who are in their 40s, early 50s, is about cultural differences and international teams. And many of them, they haven't spent significant time abroad or lived abroad or managed international teams before. And as we start to explore cultural differences, I share three stories with them, and I'd like to share those with you today. The the first one is something that happened to me. It was back in the early 90s. I was living in Budapest at the time and having a conversation with a friend named Sasha, who was from Moscow, Christoph, who was from Germany, and we were speaking about, for some reason, we were speaking about when television was introduced into different countries and color television came about. And so Sasha, the Muscovite, Sasha says that that they had television in the Soviet Union ever since they won the war. So I said, Sasha, what are you talking about? Which war do you refer to? And he says, the war we won. He says, the Great Patriotic War. What you refer to as World War II. And I sat back and I said, really? Who won the war? He says, we did. The Russians beat the Germans. And the Americans came in to help afterwards. And I said, well, that's not the way we learned it. And Christoph then explained to me, Germans didn't lose the war. We beat ourselves by opening up two fronts. And I said, you guys got it all wrong. The way we learned it was there was a war in Europe and the Americans came in to help again, and we beat the Germans. So here we were looking at this same thing, how did World War II end? And we all had three very different explanations based upon where we grew up. And I was telling Valerie, a friend of mine from France, this story later, and she laughed. She says, you guys got it all wrong. It was the French resistance that beat the Germans that allowed the war to end. So the thing to think about with cultural differences is to think about on your international team, what was going on in the world when these people were 14? How did they learn about history? How did they learn about the worldview? Ask yourself that question about each of your team members, and that'll give you a little bit more insight into how they're framing things. Because cultural differences, it's about a mental model. We all have different mental models and of how we view the world, how we interpret the world. And if we look at that in terms of when we were 14, it'll help give you some insight. Let me give you another example. Growing up in Chicago, my father had a restaurant. And when you'd walk into the restaurant, somebody would be there at the door to greet you, and they would take you to your seat. And so when I first moved to Budapest in early 91, I went out to get something to eat. I walked into the restaurant, and I stood there, and I was waiting for someone to seat me. And I could see the waiters were looking at me, and then I would wait, and then they would wait, and then things got uncomfortable, and then after a few minutes, I would leave. And then it happened a second time, and it happened a third time, and I got frustrated. I ended up going to McDonald's. The next day, we tried this all again, went to a restaurant. They were waiting for me. I was waiting for them, and I didn't understand what was happening. And then the third day, someone came up and sat me. And he explained to me, he spoke English, and he says, you're not from around here, I can tell. He said, when you come into a restaurant, just seat yourself. We'll come find you. It was a script I wasn't used to. You just walk into a restaurant and you seat yourself, where in my father's restaurant, you would walk in and somebody would seat you. And it gets to this cognitive psychology construct called scripts. We all have ways of interpreting, ways we're used to that certain patterns of things happen, the sequence of events, a script. My script when you enter a restaurant was, you walk in, they seat you. So it's very important when you think of international teams and cross-cultural awareness to think of what are the scripts, what are these cognitive scripts, the sequence of events that people are used to, what have they been brought up with, and how is that different from yours? You would think going into a restaurant, it would be exactly the same, but it's not always. It can be very different. The scripts can be different. There's one more instance I'd like to share with you. It's a multinational team. We were putting together a conference, a training program and conference, and we were talking about the time when the speaker should come in. And one person on the team from America had suggested that the guest speaker be an after-dinner speaker. The Englishman on the team was saying, well, I'm not so sure about that, and then the Spaniard didn't like it at all. And then we got into an argument, debating pedagogy, learning theory, timing of the program, all of these different things about when this guest speaker should speak in terms of the after-dinner speaking slot. And this went on for about an hour, and then we took a bit of a break. We started looking at the schedule, and then we realized The problem was we got hung up on this idea of an after-dinner speaker. And when we looked at the schedule for the time dinner was, we all started to remark on what time we're used to having dinner. So for the American, having dinner at 6 p.m., you could have an after-dinner speaker. For the Englishman, it's a little bit trickier because dinner is like 7:38, so an after-dinner speaker is a little bit late. Typically, they would have a pre-dinner speaker. And for the Spaniard, an after-dinner speaker is very late because dinner didn't start till 10 p.m. So this whole idea of just scheduling the speaker got us into a whole cultural confusion, if you will, because we had different mental models of when dinner should occur. Should it be at 6 p.m. or 7:30 p.m. or 10 p.m.? So these mental models that we carry around with us, it's sort of like a fish. Doesn't know it's in the water until it's out of the water. We're not aware of them because we just happen to have them. So ask yourself these questions. What's the script that this person may have based on where they're from? What mental models do they have that are different from mine? And what was the world like when they were 14? How were they brought up to look at things? If you look and you think about these, it'll help you in building a more effective international team.